briefed representatives of the CIA, the National Security Council, the Department of State, the Department of Defense, and he appears regularly on Fox News, CNN, and other news outlets. He is currently a distinguished senior fellow at the Gatestone Institute. And with that, Mr. Gordon Chang. And Christine, please begin recording. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Michael, and thank you all for participating today. In our new turbulent era, the most consequential developments are occurring inside the Communist Party. And these developments will determine whether or not the war spreads and consumes the world. Unfortunately, we have less and less visibility inside the regime as it closes itself off. But nonetheless, we can see unusual and sometimes even unprecedented developments occurring at an accelerated pace, and that tells us that the regime is in turmoil. Now, this turmoil is especially evident in the People's Liberation Army. So, for instance, on October 24th, Beijing announced the removal of its defense minister, General Li Shangfu. General Li had not been seen in public after August 29th. And what is surprising is that no successor has been named. We also see, for instance, that General Liu Yao, a former Air Force general officer, a prominent military thinker in China, was reportedly given a death sentence in early part of this year. But really, the most disturbing developments are taking place inside China's rocket force, which is the branch of the Chinese military that is responsible for almost all of the country's nuclear weapons. There are reports that a rocket force deputy commander committed suicide on July 6. This summer, we learned that the top two officers in the rocket force, the commander and the political commissar, were replaced. The removal of the top two officers simultaneously is unprecedented. Also, their replacements did not come within that branch. They came from the Chinese Navy and the Chinese Air Force. All in all, it is, by one count, 11 rocket force general officers were disappeared this summer. Now, this turmoil in the military is also mirrored in the civilian part of the Communist Party. So, for instance, the foreign minister, Chang, was appointed in December. He was disappeared shortly thereafter, and he was formally removed at the end of July. There are rumors, probably untrue, but we don't know, but there are rumors that Chang hanged himself or, more probably, was executed. Question is, what's going on? And to do that, let's take a look at the rocket force, because those are the most important of these personnel transfers. There are three alternative theories for what's going on. The one that most people accept is that Xi Jinping actually sacked the rocket force officers. And people believe that he did that because he wanted officers who would obey his commands to launch nuclear weapons should he give the order. And if this is the explanation, then the chance of war is exceedingly high. And also, the world's first nuclear exchange, initiated by China, is a distinct possibility. There is some evidence that suggests that this possibility is true. So, for instance, the rumors about Liu Yao, that former Air Force general, people say that he was removed because he was opposed to an invasion of Taiwan. And indeed, other officers who have been opposed to going to war had been removed this year. The second alternative is that Xi Jinping did not remove these rocket force officers, that they were removed by Xi Jinping's enemies. After all, the people who were disappeared were Xi Jinping's own men, and that gives credence to the second alternative. What we have also seen is unprecedented waves of this turbulence. These purges are coming out of nowhere. They're starting at the top of the Chinese political system, which is unusual. And the newly purged, as I mentioned, have all been Xi Jinping's people. So this suggests an out of control political upheaval. Now, we know that there's pervasive unhappiness with Xi Jinping. After all, for more than 10 years, he's been taking money and power away from his rivals. And there is a feeling that they have been waiting in the background to get even. Also, I don't believe too much in coincidences when it comes to distress in the Communist Party. And we've got to remember that all of these personnel changes in the military, in the rocket force, in the civilian aspects of the Communist Party, they've been occurring at the start of Xi Jinping's third term as general secretary of the party. This is a third term that nobody in Beijing really wanted him to have. So it is possible that Xi has lost significant power recently. And to put a point on this, there's been no replacement for the defense minister. If Xi Jinping were really powerful, he should have been able to not only remove General Li Shangfu, but he should have also been able to replace him. And that tells us, it's not determinative, but it does tell us that there is out of control distress. Now, the third theory is that Xi Jinping has become a paranoid and that he has basically been junking his own people because he's been suspicious about their loyalty. Now, supporting this are rumors that Xi Jinping has been changing his doctors recently because he doesn't trust them. Now, if this is the case, it means that China's leaders starting to look like Joseph Stalin. After all, both of them have purged a lot of people, and perhaps they are suspicious of everyone around them, which would only be natural, as we have seen in country after country. Once a leader accumulates almost total power, they become absolutely suspicious of everybody around them. But the point for us is we have to ask the question, what happens when a Chinese leader who's already been threatening to use his nuclear weapons descends deeper into dark visions of the future? As I mentioned, we don't know which of these explanations are correct or whether any of them are correct. The only people who really know what's going on are those at the highest levels of the Communist Party. That means we are largely bystanders to these extremely important events. And it also means that although the US has overwhelming leverage over China, should we care to use it, it may not matter. We may not be able to deter China because Xi Jinping may be reacting solely to domestic pressures. In any event, we can see from world's events today that China is the one, not the United States, but China is driving events. Now, whatever is the case with these purges and disappearances and unusual developments, we can see that Xi Jinping has turned China upside down. And as such, this current moment resembles the first years of the People's Republic when Mao Zedong was in charge. Mao took a regime that was supposed to be run by a committee and turned it into one-man rule. Mao's successor, Deng Xiaoping, started to go back to committee rule as he tried to institutionalize the Communist Party. Now, Xi Jinping has reversed that institutionalization as he's grabbed power from everybody else, as he's grabbed power like Mao Zedong did. Now, Mao, with his accumulated power, embarked on these zany campaigns like the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, which almost destroyed China and indeed almost ended the rule of the Communist Party. But for all of Mao's power, he was not able to start a global war. Xi Jinping, on the other hand, does. And we know one thing. Xi Jinping cannot stop talking about war. Most famously, in his speech on July 1st, 2021, a landmark address, which was to talk about the centennial of the founding of the Communist Party, Xi Jinping said that he would, quote, crack skulls and spill blood, that's of people who were standing in his way. He's continued this imagery. In March of this year, at the National People's Congress, he repeated what is his now favorite phrase, which is dare to fight. And that message has been filtering down through the ranks. So for instance, in the following month, April, at the Eastern Theater Command of the People's Liberation Army, after it completed provocative air and naval exercises around Taiwan, proclaimed that it was, quote, ready to fight. And in July, Xi Jinping, dressed in military green, went to the Eastern Theater Command, which, by the way, is the command that would lead an invasion of Taiwan, and gave another one of his let's go out and invade somebody speeches. But Xi Jinping is doing more than just talking. He is implementing the largest and fastest military buildup since the Second World War. He's trying to sanction-proof his regime. He's stockpiling grain and other commodities. He's surveying the United States for nuclear weapons strikes, as we'll talk about in a moment. He is supporting other bad actors like Russia and China in their war efforts. And he is mobilizing China's civilians for war. And Beijing's mobilization of civilians is serious. So for instance, last July of last year, a Chinese entrepreneur making medical equipment for the consumer sector told me that Communist Party officials had visited him and demanded that he convert his production lines in China to make items for the Chinese military. Communist Party officials have been fanning out across China, making similar demands. And indeed, this entrepreneur told me that the party was actually operating factories that were once privately owned because their owners had received similar demands and had decided not to stick around for Xi Jinping's war. So we have Xi Jinping on a warlike path. And the question is, what does he want? And unfortunately, he wants everything. Xi Jinping has been working to impose China's imperial era system, where Chinese emperors believed that they not only had the mandate of heaven to rule what they called Tianxia, or all under heaven, but that actually heaven compelled them to rule the entire world. Now, Xi Jinping, throughout this century, has been using these Tianxia themes, and so have his subordinates. So, for instance, Wang Yi, foreign minister, in 2017, wrote an article in Study Times, which is the Central Party School's influential newspaper. And in that article, Wang Yi wrote that Xi Jinping's thought on diplomacy, and in Communist Party lingo, a thought is an important body of ideological work. Wang Yi wrote that Xi Jinping's thought on diplomacy, quote, has made innovations and transcended traditional Western theories of international relations of the past 300 years. Take 2017, subtract 300 years, and you almost get to 1648. So Wang Yi, with his time reference, was pointing to the Peace of Westphalia of 1648, which established the current system of sovereign competing states. So when Wang Yi says that Xi Jinping wants to transcend the system, what he's really saying is that China's leader does not believe that they are sovereign states, or at least know more of them than China. Now, you will hear a lot of smart people in Washington and New York and elsewhere say, you know, the Chinese are just competing with us in the international system. Well, no, that's not right. They're not even trying to change that system. They're trying to overthrow it altogether, which means that China's leader, once again, is a revolutionary. So what could be worse than wanting to, or thinking that you have the right to rule the entire planet? Well, since 2017, Chinese officials have been talking about the moon and Mars as sovereign Chinese territory. So yes, Xi Jinping wants Mackinder's heartland, but he wants everything else as well. Now, while Xi Jinping harbors these grand ambitions, makes him the most ambitious aggressor in history, and while Xi Jinping just talks about war and prepares for war, his country is facing simultaneous crises. So, for instance, there are continuing debt defaults, plunging property prices, a stagnating economy, worsening food shortages, a deteriorating environment, and failing local governments. A few hours ago, we just learned that both consumer and producer prices in China dropped last month, which means that China has returned to deflation. But today I want to focus on the property sector because it is core to the Chinese economy. Property constitutes 19%, accounts for 19% of gross domestic product. That's down, by the way, from 25% of last year. And property represents 70% of household wealth in China. Now, we know that there's an oversupply of apartments in China, but we didn't know how bad it was. A month ago, a former deputy chief of the National Bureau of Statistics gave a speech in Guangdong where he said that the oversupply of apartments in China is so bad that the excess apartments could hold all of China's 1.4 billion people. Now, not everybody in China agrees with that number. Some people believe that there are enough excess apartments to house 3 billion people. So you can understand why property prices have been falling. Recently, however, the government has moved in to interfere in the market to stop the precipitous decline in property values. And it's done that by refusing to register any transaction where sales prices fall below a government set minimum. So yeah, the government has been able to arrest the decline in prices this year, but that, of course, has resulted in a collapse in sales. In 2022, property sales in China declined 26.8%. Last month, the property sales of China's 100 largest developers fell 27.5%. In September, property investment was down 18.7% year on year. That was this 19th straight month of decline. And new construction starts in the first 9 months of this year, compared to the comparable period last year, fell 23.4%. So as you can see, property is core to the Chinese economy and it's in trouble. And because of that, China has now a new problem to add to the list, and that is accelerating capital flight. And in trying to arrest that, China has been burning through its foreign exchange reserves at a fast pace. All of this has left the Chinese people desperate. They are opting out of society. The young, as they say, are lying flat. People who can leave are doing so. And there is an unprecedented surge of people outside of the country. So Sam, which is a pseudonym, Sam, who entered the United States in February at Brownsville, Texas, told Axios this, quote, "It's like an animal stampede before an earthquake." So for many people, there's no hope left. And you can see why, because they can see China's leaders. His solution is to cut China off from the rest of the world and to centralize power in himself through party organs that are answerable only to him. Moreover, the country's on the edge of a demographic decline, the steepest in history in the absence of war or disease. A year ago, 2 Chinese demographers predicted that the country could lose half of its population in 45 years if the total fertility rate for the country remained at 1.3. The total fertility rate is the average number of children per female of childbearing age. But unfortunately for Beijing, China's TFR is 1.18. And some demographers actually think it's 0.9. So you put all this together and it could mean that China could be 1/3 as populous as it is today when the clock strikes 2100. That's going from 1.4 billion down to maybe 480 million, maybe 500 million. And that would mean that in China, which is now more than 4 times as populous as the US, could end up basically having the same number of people at the turn of the century. I think when you put all of these problems together, that Xi Jinping is seeing a closing window of opportunity to achieve what he considers to be historic goals. So I think that this gives Xi Jinping a low threshold of risk, and it gives him incentives to act recklessly. He may now have only one solution to China's problems, and that is to rally ugly nationalism and to invade a neighbor. Now, a lot of China watchers think he won't do that he won't launch a diversionary war, as it's called. So, for instance, M. Taylor Fravel of MIT points out correctly that communist China has never had a diversionary war. Yeah, that's true, but Xi Jinping is bold enough to break the pattern. So, we have a Chinese regime that is headed to war, and that means we are at a point of grave danger. China's already launched proxy wars. After all, it green-lighted Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It did that with its February 4, 2022 statement of no limits partnership with Moscow. That was just 20 days before Putin launched his invasion of Ukraine. Also, Beijing and Moscow have been cooperating, fueling insurgencies in North Africa that start to look like wars. And we know that China, through its backing of Iran, has effectively backed Hamas's attacks on Israel. Hamas fighters, for instance, have Chinese weapons, presumably supplied through Iran. And we know that they have large quantities of North Korean weapons. And that could not have occurred without Beijing's approval. In 2021 and this year, the US Navy has seized Chinese weapons on their way to the Houthi militia. And on October 19th of this year, the Houthis launched attacks on Israel. So what is Xi Jinping up to? I think that he's taken 2 pages out of Mao Zedong's Peasant Revolution playbook. But first of all, Mao in 1949 prevailed over Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists by encircling the cities from the countryside, as it's called. I think that Xi looks at Ukraine, North Africa, Middle East as the countryside, and the United States as the city. So in the countryside, as Mao would call it, President Biden's policies have left many soft spots for Russia and China to attack. And I think that once Xi Jinping believes that he has surrounded the cities, that he will try to starve us into submission and surrender. The second page from the playbook involves chaos. Xi Jinping has been, in one sense, promoting chaos around the world. Quote, "Great chaos under heaven achieved great order under heaven." This was Mao Zedong in 1966, writing to his wife, Chang. And by great order, he was referring to the establishment of worldwide Chinese rule. Xi Jinping's current tactics are disruption of the global order, and in a sense, barbarism serves his purposes, which means that the destruction of Ukraine and Israel, other places, will only be way stations on his plan for complete control of humanity. China saw the catastrophic withdrawal from Afghanistan, which was completed in August 2021, as a signal of the collapse of American policy. And since that time, we have seen him engaged in especially belligerent acts, and I don't believe that that was a coincidence. At the moment, the People's Liberation Army is engaging in dangerous intercepts in the global commons. At the same time, it is trying to seize portions of its neighbors. Most specifically, we all talk about Taiwan, but the real flashpoint, I believe, is the Philippines in the South China Sea, especially Scarborough and Second Thomas Shoals. On October 22nd of last month, Chinese vessels rammed 2 Philippine boats. This was after the State Department had issued a series of written warnings to China that the United States was prepared to use force to protect its ally, Manila, under our 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty. In other words, the State Department was threatening war. Obviously, China continued to escalate, which means that deterrence has failed. On October 25th, President Biden, speaking at the White House as he was welcoming the Australian Prime Minister, repeated the State Department's warnings. And now I think we have a clue as to what will happen, to see if China continues to escalate or slinks back. But of course, it's also these dangerous intercepts that I mentioned. Canada has been a particular victim of this. So a Chinese fighter came within 5 meters of a Canadian plane in international airspace on October 16. A couple days later, on October 29, a Chinese fighter fired flares at a Canadian helicopter in international airspace over the South China Sea. On October 18th, Chinese vessels conducted an illegal survey in Japanese waters in the East China Sea near Japan's Senkakus. Now, if something horrible happens in one of these encounters, which the law of averages says that it will, then I don't think China can back down, because at the moment, only the most hostile answers are considered to be acceptable in the Chinese political system. There are a couple of reasons for that. One of them is that the Chinese military has become much more powerful and has militarized China's external policies. But also, you got to remember, as we started out, a regime in distress, a regime eating itself, cannot act responsibly. In the 1930s, we saw separate wars merge into what historians now call World War II. At the moment, there are separate conflicts around the world, and the question for us is whether those conflicts will indeed merge. If they do, it will be a fight to the finish, and it's unlikely to stay conventional. Beijing has threatened to use nuclear weapons preemptively, especially starting in the middle of 2021 against Japan and Australia. China is now involved in essentially quadrupling this number of its warheads, going from about 300 or 400 to maybe 1,500 in 2035. As the Secretary of the Air Force, Kendall, talked about in testimony at the end of last year. We have seen, I think, Xi Jinping probably adopt Mao Zedong's views on why it was in China's interest to actually use the world's most destructive weapons. You got to remember that rather large object that China flew over our country in January and February. That balloon passed close by Maelstrom, F.E. Warren, and Minot Air Force bases, where we have all of our Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missiles, the entire land portion of the triad. It also passed nearby Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, the home of all of our B-2 strategic bombers, and it flew by Omaha, Nebraska, close to Offutt Air Force Base, the headquarters of U.S. Strategic Command, which controls all of U.S. nuclear weapons. So China is obviously preparing, thinking about nuclear weapon strikes on the American homeland. So war can cause unimaginable devastation. We have heard Vladimir Putin issue threats against Ukraine to use his nuclear weapons, both tactical and strategic. He has a doctrine which has been called escalate to de-escalate or escalate to win. You use or threaten nuclear weapons in a conventional conflict. And as I mentioned, Xi Jinping's regime has been making similar new threats of its own. One final point about the war that is to come. Henry Kissinger, in his June 7th interview with Bloomberg, said that war between China and the United States was, quote unquote, probable. He was talking about Taiwan. In that interview, he treats the United States and China as equally culpable and implicitly blames both of us. No wonder Beijing considers Henry Kissinger an old friend. And no wonder Beijing loves Graham Allison's Destined for War: Can America and China Escape the Thucydides Trap? That's a book the Pentagon loves, and it implicitly blames the United States as well, like Kissinger, because it says the United States is a declining power, China's a rising one, and we're jealous. That's wrong on almost every count. But the point is, yes, Kissinger and Allison are right to think that war is coming, that war is indeed probable, but they're wrong about the reasons. The reason why we're heading for war is that China is run by an aggressive militant regime, a regime that idealizes domination, struggle, and violence. And that regime considers the United States to be an existential threat. It considers the United States to be an existential threat, not because of anything that we say or do, but because of who we are. An insecure regime in Beijing is worried about the inspirational impact of American values and form of governance over the Chinese people. And this means that, try as we might, we will never have amicable, acceptable relations with China as long as the Communist Party rules it. China's on a war footing. We think that we're at peace. We should understand what's coming. Of course, nothing in geopolitics is inevitable, but it's clear the direction the world is now taking. The peace of the Cold War period is now over. We are, whether we like it or not, locked in a global struggle with a coalition of countries, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and the backer of them all, which is China. Now, Len and Michael wrote an article in The Hill 2 years ago, and they wrote this: 2 world wars and the Cold War were waged to keep hostile powers from dominating Mackinder's heartland. Now, it appears that there are hostile powers are not only after the heartland, but also after the Eurasian littoral. And that means that Mackinder's geopolitical nightmare is now becoming a reality. Thank you.